welcome to the Stump, where I discuss various forestry issues, career, personal development, and anything else on my mind. I'm your host, Matt Comiskey, and today we are joined by Jenny Knoth, PhD. She currently is listed as a forest land management and policy advisor with a very impressive resume, and I would argue probably way smarter than I am, but we'll go with that. And so I guess welcome, Jenny, and look forward to the conversation here today. And maybe we can start with you just telling a little bit about yourself, your current work in forestry, and and kind of maybe some of your past career experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Matt. It is actually kind of a good place to start is in the early years. I studied microbiology as an undergrad, and what got me really interested in the field was oil eating bacteria. So I was definitely influenced when the Exxon Valdez crashed. We had a big oil spill in the Prince William Sound, and I found that there's natural solutions to some of our issues, and so that got me on a kind of an interesting career path. I didn't realize how difficult it would be to make a career out of that exactly in that time, in those years. Meanwhile, my dad was always whispering, um, for clarity, my dad is a retired forester, longtime forest manager, got his start, in the 50s as a firefighter. So he was always telling me, hey, there's this great interaction of microbes and trees. You should really look into forestry. It'll be great. And fast forward a little bit, I found myself in North Carolina working in an animal disease diagnostic lab. And when I needed to learn something about um, doing some genetic testing, I actually went to the forestry department at NC State and learned had a short course, and in that process became familiar with the professors and their program. And next thing you know, I enrolled for a master's degree in forest genetics with a influence or emphasis on pathology, and just kind of took off from there. So my I wasn't a direct descendant into the forest in or timber industry or forest practices, even though I'm a daughter of a forester, sister of a forester. You'd think that I just naturally would have gone that route, but it took me a minute to figure it out. Um, and so I took the forest genetics from NC State and was able to work for International Paper for a while in a research program. And while there, we moved our lab a few times. We were co-located with Arizona Chemical. They used like the byproducts from the pulping process for lots of different things. So I'm in the lab doing genetics, and I have lunch with a lot of chemists that are using these wood products. I never would have thought of the things that you could get out of a tree at that time. So got me really interested in the potential for energy, using our paper byproduct, the tall oil, for energy. So moved back to Washington and was able to find a PhD program. I wasn't really looking for one. I was really looking for a job, but it turned out that there was a fellowship, so it became my job. And the emphasis there was on bioresource-based energy for sustainable communities. So looking at rural communities and how there's an interaction for how can we support these communities with bioresource-based energy? And that's kind of that path was never really straightforward to where I am now. Even along the way, how did I end up in policy of all things? I'm a research scientist. Well, if we're going to do good policy, we should probably base it on good science. And luckily, along the way, some people recognized that they had a need, and I was available, so became a policy consultant. But it's not so much that I'm consulting on the policy. I'm on the other end, the other side, hoping that we're using good science to inform that policy. Um, and just because I can't do just one thing, I'm also interested in sustainability certifications. I found during COVID there was a need for some auditors, independent contractors to be auditors because the traveling wasn't happening very much in those years. So I've become an auditor for sustainability standards, and I love it because I get to meet and see meet a lot of different foresters and see how different landowners approach sustainability, how they're all conforming to the same standard, some of them doing it very differently, but they're all conforming, and it's amazing work on the ground.
No, I think that's actually pretty fascinating. And I think that's one thing I always try to explain to people that I always view forestry or the work of a forester is the art of applying that science to managing land and managing trees, and that means that that art can express itself in many different ways, even though you're still basing it on the same kind of basic science principles, which makes it, of course, helps, I guess, in that certification world, allowing multiple management regimes, those type of things, to still meet the same long term sustainability. So, no, I think that's good, and I there's a spot I kind of want to go with this conversation in a minute that you touched on there, but I think first, is there anything like kind of in your current or even more like your past work that's been kind of specifically kind of more rewarding or sticks out in your mind? I mean, it's already we got a little taste of the varied and interesting aspects of your work. So,
Um, I have had the opportunity to work and give back to the University of Washington's School of Environmental and Forest Sciences as a an affiliate professor, and I occasionally get to fill in and instruct a class, and so that and just out in the public. So to me, that the rewarding experience is talking to people who don't know as much or don't know what we do as a forester. Um, I love loggers. They help me do what I need to do. You know, as a forester, the loggers are part of our set of how we employ our prescriptions and our management. Um, but a lot of people get us confused. Oh, you're a forester, so you're running chainsaws all day. I'm like, part of me says, oh, I wish. And the other part of me says, like, no, I run a pencil all day long, right? So it's the rewarding part is the education and opening people up to changing their view on forestry, whether it's, you know, little incremental changes to how they view managed forests, but having an opportunity to talk about what we do is really important to me. And I do find it rewarding because I find that when we're in a situation and people are willing to listen, they learn a lot. And we get to talk about and I get to brag about what I see other people do on the landscape. So I know I'm a part of ag forestry program, and during one of our seminars, we learned to talk to the media, and they thought they were giving me a hard question by asking me, "Well, aren't clear cuts ugly?" And I convinced my entire class that clear cuts are probably the most beautiful thing ever because there's the butterflies and the birds, and that part was pretty funny. We made a joke about it, but sincerely, I think a lot of my classmates do now view a clear cut as something quite different and necessary at times on the landscape.
yeah, no, I think that's critical. And, it is surprising how many people, when they ask me questions about, well, what do you think about clear cuts and all that? And and for me, yeah, once all the logging equipment's gone, everything's done, and that 6 month time frame on average that is just brown, there's not much there. Yeah, I admit it can be kind of ugly, but I also kind of look at it just like you said, is the new diversity. I'm a beekeeper, so when a large industrial landowner did a 40 year acre, boy, I can't talk today, clear cut behind where I keep my bees. I know a lot of the local neighbors were like, "Oh, that's ugly." I was like, "Oh man, think of all the new forage for my bees. All sorts of new wildflowers and blackberries and everything else." So I think it's changing that perspectives, but I think that's critical. And I think having your kind of real world experience reaching out to influencing the next generation that's coming through the colleges, I think is really important for our industry as a whole going forward, because I feel like there's a lot more urban kids going through the colleges in the environmental programs than there were rural kids these days. And so so with that, maybe we'll kind of get into the meat of what really kind of made me think, and we got to talking about this podcast back actually at an ag forestry event that we were both at. So I
Yep.
always have to put the little plug in for ag forestry. Um, and and then recently you posted on LinkedIn, I know it was a couple months ago, about the impacts of wealth gaps, and I'd argue kind of buried in that comment, in your thoughts on that was to a degree kind of the divide between the urban environmentalists and the rural residents that rely on natural resources. So I kind of want to dig a little deeper into that because it's been popping up in a lot of different places, and I know my work, I tend to deal with a lot of the opposition to active sustainable forest management is tends to be older, wealthy urbanites. And so I guess, um, first off, I guess, can you explain a little bit more about your post? And then maybe we can kind of go as to, is this something bigger than just forestry? And or how big of an issue is it? Because I also sometimes realize that we all in the policy world operate in a little bit of a small microcosm. We get to hear all the loud, obnoxious voices. We may not hear all the quiet, broader voices that may actually support us.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think sometimes the loud, obnoxious voice, they get heard, right? Squeaky wheel. It may not be the real problem. We uh, um a distracting injury, right? So something that may not be the root cause, but it sure gets a lot of attention. Um, so my post was coming around the time when I was aware of some protests on state timber sales. A lot of folks, they move a little outside the urban area, like outside of some of our bigger cities. They get on that interface, and then they start to see change happen, and they don't want it. They moved to be by those trees or to be in that environment that is in their minds static, the way it should be, kind of. Um, but these protests on these timber sales, they really impact, I think, all Washingtonians, and it adds up. So I had been looking at statistics and some numbers, and I don't have it with me right now, but along with that post, I had a graphic that displayed how much money gets put back into Washington from a state trust land timber sale. So we have a constitutional mandate that our trust lands that make money for certain parts of all of us, like our daily lives, schools, hospitals, the police department. There's these junior taxing districts that get a little piece of every timber sale that's in the trust land system. And there's different kinds of trust lands, and there's other people who are more expert at talking about that. And I don't think that's our goal here. Um, but just even little bit by little bit adds up. So we just got our renewed um, tax statement on our house, property tax statement, and it goes up, right? And it goes up because, oh, look, your house went up or whatever. But when I start to look at the breakdown, all of where the percentage of that tax goes, and I think, gosh, if we continue to stop timber sales, that's just going to continue to go up. And here's where I feel fortunate. Okay, maybe I can afford that, but younger people trying to get into home ownership, that starts to become a real cost. People who want to have rent, right? It's not passed on to the owner, it's passed on to the people who rent. And we're talking about housing being a problem, affordability of just living is a problem sometimes. And so I started to connect the dots. Um, it may not look like a lot of money at first, but every little bit starts to add up. And I think over time, we we really see that there's a negative consequence, and maybe it's an unintended consequence of stopping these timber sales. And my thought was, the where does that drive come from to stop a timber sale? Because a lot of people in their daily lives probably don't know that that's happening. They may not even notice. Oh, look, a timber sale. It's kind of like, oh, look, the corn got harvested. It'll be back next year. With timber, it'll be back in 5 years. You'll start to watch it grow, but that initial assault is really offensive, I think, to people who can afford to have a second home, people who can afford that bigger house outside the city. And so then we start to see a wealth divide. Um, it, it I lived in a community on the top of the peninsula, of the Olympic Peninsula, and we had a hard time passing school bonds when my children were going to school there. I remember one day my son came home from science class and basically got rained on in his classroom, but we could not pass a school bond. We can't. And so I think they're not disconnected. And I'm not trying to gripe. I'm not complaining. I guess my whole point was to try to connect the dots for people that aren't aware, or who don't know to pay attention to these things. And yeah, so and I do think it's sometimes it's a community, or is it an age group or a wealth gap that says, well, I got mine, I'm fine. You guys will be fine. You'll figure it out. But we forget that we have to do this as a team.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's critical. One of those sales I happen to know that was being questioned and challenged. Most of the folks coming to complain about it were living in a gated community connected to a golf course. And we're talking about a stand of trees between a high voltage transmission line and a railway. So, not your stereotypical, beautiful wilderness type old growth that's in the picture behind you. And, to me, that to me was really telling of, is this really about people's concerns over the environment and the trees, or is this they just don't like change? They've got theirs. Not cutting it doesn't really affect them. And so they're going to come and, complain, even though, I like to tell people I have, quite a few friends I would consider fairly left of center in Seattle where I grew up, and not one of them have ever really asked me about certification standards, but I do get asked about why lumber prices are up if they need to buy lumber. So, to me, that's a little instructive of, I think getting at the average everyday person is not really tuned into this stuff. And so is it more of a kind of a NIMBYism, or I think in many cases it's a more of an emotional reaction and a lack of understanding.
Oh, I think it's absolutely emotional. I took on a course called Forests and Society for last spring. And and if you're going to teach something, clearly you have to go learn it. So I did a deep dive and just kind of tried to seek out this long-term relationship of humans, between humans and their forests, or humans and their trees. And we are connected to trees. They're spiritual symbols. Their forests are both something to be held in reverence and in fear. I mean, we are not disconnected from our environment by any means. So when we start to look at it, with these policies and things, we can't dissociate the emotion. And I also did a little bit of investigation on values. How do people determine their value? Like, we may say we value something the same way, but when you really get down to the root, there's maybe a different reason, or there's subjective values. And again, a whole different topic, right? But those values come into play when we view whether we have a timber sale, or do we value education, or do we value the big tree? What do we value more?
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting. My brain is sitting here processing a lot of that, and that is an interesting question, and I'm very clearly aware of the challenges the community used to live in, trying to pass bonds, and we have another community down in Southwest Washington that, desperately needs some new school buildings, and they're struggling to pass bonds. Timber revenue from state trust lands is anywhere from 30 to 40% of the county's annual budget. The schools actually don't get any money through that process, though they do get harvest excise tax. And I think that that's something that I do feel like a lot of these folks miss that connection when they say, well, we shouldn't fund schools through timber harvest. And I think Commissioner Franz back in was the July Board of Natural Resources meeting said it well best is, if you need $100 to go buy groceries, are you going to step over the $50 bill laying on the ground because you need $100 to go buy groceries? I think most people would stop and pick up the $50 bill, which is kind of the way I look at, state trust lands managed under, incredible environmental regulations. I'd argue probably stronger than most places in the world. And so, if we can do that in a place that grows trees like weeds, why would we step over the $50 bills because we really need $100 bills? But um, I guess, this in some way feels like it's a much bigger issue. I mean, because we see all the crazy things playing out in the media and politics. And I guess if it's a bigger social issue, kind of, the tribalism of, the people who don't like trees being cut going one way and the people are okay with it going another way. How do we as an industry start to work and address that?
Communication is large, I think. And we talk about seeing posts on LinkedIn. I think that there's some people who are doing a fantastic job of showing what they do and trying to bring it to light and being very transparent. It may be a little bit of an echo chamber because it is ultimately social media and there's algorithms that just show me what I click on. Um, so I have to actively click on different things sometimes just to try to enrich what comes at me. But I'm seeing more creative ways to communicate what we do. So I think that's definitely one step um, in that process. Writing letters, inviting people out on tours. Um, you still you still see and hear that even in just the basic understanding of what forest does what, people will ask a park ranger about Forest Service issues or or back and forth or state land and I don't know that we can educate everybody on how it all works or even that we should, but having some exposure and transparency about what we're doing as land managers is fantastic. And I people talk about that and they roll their eyes like, well, you're a scientist for the industry, so it's like tobacco. I'm like, it's nothing like tobacco. We invite you to come and see us, and I don't mean to pick on another industry, but I think that one had its day when I was a kid, so maybe yeah. Um, I find with certification, um, that's an effort to be very transparent about management policies and practices, and then being held accountable for it. Certification isn't free, it isn't required, and it certainly doesn't have any true financial benefit for those who are certified. What I mean by that is if you are certified by there's four certification um, standards that a landowner could choose appropriate to where they live, and they're really very similar. Um, at the mill gate, there's not a premium. So you don't come up and say, "Well, I'm certified." And the mill gate is going to give you a high five and say thanks. We can put our stamp on the products, and that is really meant to be transparent. That's really meant to be come and look at what we do. I have somebody come and look at me every year. They go through all my paperwork. It's an exhaustive audit, and they can say that I'm still certified to this standard. So I think that's part of it is those certification organizations are doing a better job of telling the story as well. Um, so that gets to the consumer. And isn't that really how we all vote anyway? Like what we buy?
Yeah,
So,
no,
yeah.
yeah, no, I think you're right, and that's always one challenge when I hear, even some of the folks that are opposing, active forest management in Washington, um, well, this certification is better than that certification. And I always point out to them that really they're all basically the same. There's slight variations and nuances in their protocols. And at the end of the day, the landowner isn't really getting any more money for their logs if they're certified under one or the other or not certified. And that's because at the end of the day, the majority of lumber that goes out of the other side of the mill doesn't get any increased value if it's certified under one or the other or certified at all. It just either preserves an existing market or typically, as I see it, is usually used as preserving certain customer relationships because certain customers may rely on it for their product where they might actually see a premium. But otherwise, it still comes down to, is your product 20% more expensive than than the other competitor's product? Well, I want the cheaper product. So,
Yeah.
and I don't know how, if that ever gets addressed, but I guess, you know, the thing for me is I also feel like there's almost like a business on kind of I call it the anti forestry movement because I consider all of us environmentalists.
Yep.
I'm every month that I go on the radio down in Grace Harbor, I get asked the question, "Do you want to cut every tree in the state?" And I'm like, "No, there's places to manage forests. There's places to not manage. There's places to manage for high yield fiber production. There's places to manage for habitat, all that kind of stuff." And I tend to try to stay away from the term environmentalist because I think they've kind of stolen that term from us. But I guess, as I dig into that world, the funding,
Yeah.
and that all these groups are fighting for funding. We just saw, the Bullet Foundation close its doors, that had funded, some groups. And, some groups that were actually productive in the whole forest health wildfire range. But, a lot of these big foundations are on the East Coast. And I know when some of the folks I talked to that have interacted with some of them recently, they've been shocked and surprised to find out what their money goes to. And so I guess I almost wonder if that's a better way, because when you talk about wealth gaps, I mean, we're talking extremely wealthy foundations that tend to not be geographically located where a lot of these issues are going on. And so I guess if that's I wonder how the industry can engage more at that level to help educate, really. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still their choice to spend their money how they want.
Yeah.
But, should we as an industry be more focused at trying to educate some of those groups?
It's not a bad idea. I still believe that there is a bit of the environmental economic machine, if you will. If you put a picture of a sad puppy, we all want to give 35 cents a day. If you create a
Just
problem,
one cup of coffee.
just one cup of coffee. Yeah, I know. I grew up with those ads. Um, I think there's this save a tree sticker that goes around on like, don't wipe your hands on the paper towel, save a tree. I had a sticker that was basically save a student, buy paper. It's like it goes both ways. Um, it- the messaging can be very compelling, but at the end of the day, some of the groups I think that get funded, they're they may be funding people who create problems that aren't there. And that's difficult for me. And I that's where I get emotional and I have a hard time. You Somebody comes to this situation or somewhere to just stand there and tell you, hey, today the sky is not blue. Today it's magenta. And I'm not going to say anything. You look up and you're like, no, it's still blue. There's no clouds. No, it's magenta. and they won't leave. It's like talking to a brick wall, but they were paid very well to just hold position. And I find in my policy work that regardless of science, regardless of trying to be collaborative, there are occasionally moments where I meet with people who say, I am not budging, I will not budge. And I wonder if it hurts them on the inside because I've known them outside the arena, and it's like, I know that you can read what I'm reading. Why are you doing this? And I think some of it has to be a little bit you know, they're being paid, it's their job, they're doing a good job for the people who they're working for. So where does that go? And maybe I'm being cynical, and I don't mean to bring a negativity to the podcast because I certainly don't live with negativity. But sometimes it's hard to not see this, and wonder how do I get past and collaborate with a group that clearly makes money when they've contrived a problem that isn't there.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. And I appreciate the not wanting to bring negativity. I think sometimes it's important, though, for those of us that do work in this policy space to discuss these things where other people, particularly the field forester that doesn't understand it, all they're seeing is you're doing everything wrong. You're a horrible person for becoming a forester. When there actually should be celebrated for the resources and the value that they're bringing to society. And so I think it's important that we highlight some of those things. And I agree, it is frustrating. Sometimes I have to remind myself, yeah, they're just paid that that they're doing it. I've been accused of the same thing of being a shill for the timber industry. That most people don't understand is that yes, I have this as my job, but it's been a passion since I was in college. My public speaking classes, all my topics were around the timber wars and the spotted owl issue, and defending the loggers in the forest products sector, even though I was a kid of the big city. So I think it's important to address that, but I think it's also important that people understand that the more that we seek out those ways to collaborate, we can hopefully at least turn the people that can start saying, no, I'm not going to give you my 1 cup of coffee a week money to keep this going. I still go back to an example of a field trip I did on the Olympic National Forest with an older lady, probably in her mid 70s, that was dead set against the group I was with doing thinning in the forest on the national forest. And I walked her out into the edge of a harvest unit that had been primarily thinned, but had also been pre-commercially thinned. And I found a stump, and I just sat down and walked her through the rings and explained to her how the rings changed of very wide and then very narrow as the stand got denser and denser, and then it got thinned, and the rings started to get wider again, and then we could fortunately see where they were starting to slow down. And she looks at me and goes, so you're talking about like thinning the carrots in my garden? And I said, yes. And she says, okay, we're done. We can go back to the car. I'm done with the field trip. I'm good with what you guys are doing. You won't hear from me ever again. And it was just like, but how many years had she listened to the fear mongering of we're going to clear cut all the national forests when all we were proposing to do is thin them so that we can get to older forest characteristics and healthy forests faster. So I do think that's critical, and there are all these unintended consequences, but I think just continuing to have conversations and dialogue, not only internal to the industry but external, I think is critical because I
Field
know in some of
trips.
my work, when people find out that road maintenance in their local county is tied to a timber sale, because money ends up in the road budget for the county, all of a sudden they have a little different. Oh, you mean the county could fix the potholes on my street? Well, yeah. I think that's the interesting thing is I think really where maybe, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are, if the industry would be well served to help try to connect the costs of not managing to the back pocket of those who are advocating not to manage. Because right now, if you don't have kids in school, why do you care if timber sales happen or don't happen? There's a lot of folks out there that are that way. I mean, we had a bond issue here in my local community. My kids would never see the benefits of that bond, but my wife and I felt a certain obligation to the future of the city to have good schools. So we voted to raise our property taxes. But I don't think there's a lot of people in society that think that way. It's more of, well, I don't want to raise my property taxes, so I'm going to vote against this, or I'm going to oppose this timber sale. And so I don't know. What do you think about trying to connect to folks that way?
I think we're all attached to our wallet, right? Somebody decided that I was worth it when I was a kid. Wasn't me, because I was a kid, right? So some other generation said your education's worth it, and they put forth their taxes and their time. And I try to do that when I think about it. To some degree, what I have isn't all mine. It's for the kids, it's for the grandkids, it's for those next generations. Um, that is a forester talking, right? We don't plant a tree for us. We plant it for our grandkids. Um, I am a tree improvement nerd, so sometimes I say I do plant it for my kids because hopefully we're growing them faster. But um, just kidding.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Um, I think that is a good connection to make. I also like that you said field trip. I think field trips are really important too. I like and field trips are important to go to the managed lands. We're getting people outside. It's wonderful. We have outdoor sports companies that want to get people outside. They want to get them on trails. I think we also need to get folks out and see what we're doing, and explain it. And I think that's really pretty cool. I think something our Society of American Foresters groups might do well is to leverage all of our expertise as foresters because we all manage such different kinds of land for different end goals that if we were to organize field trip days, that might be something that could start to shift the conversation. It's not going to be one thing though, right? It's not one thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's you want to talk about unintended consequences. To me, I think that's the one challenge with social media is that there's so many different platforms now and so many different ways people consume information that the old days of one or two channels to reach people doesn't exist. And so it's evolving into how are we everywhere all the time?
Yeah.
Um, which gets to be difficult and time consuming and all of that. But I think, the field trips, I've definitely seen them pay off. To me, I think one of the big challenges is, it's people have lost track of where their wood comes from. You know,
Oh, yeah, we
eggs
have the
don't come
bumpers.
from the chicken, they come from Safeway. And I think anything we can do to get back to that would be critical.
Like the bumper stickers, no farms, no foods. I think there's a just little things like that get people thinking.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I love that bumper sticker. I actually have a couple mock-ups on a graphic design software for a wood-related one, but I will tell you that no farms, no foods fits really nicely. Trying to figure out exactly the no what no because forestry is so dynamic. It's
We have habitat, we have fish. It's not just wood products. And as foresters, we make that connection. Um, and I think that's part of that education. How do we talk about that? Um, yeah, talking about policy, I've been trying to get a license plate passed in legislature for a while because I think it would draw people's attention to the Forest and Fish Agreement and working forests as a whole, where if you're driving down the road and you look at this pretty license plate, you could say, "Oh, what does that mean?" and go look it up, just like the bumper sticker. We're gonna keep trying to pass it. I don't know what'll
Well,
happen, but
hopefully this coming session that has been a struggle. Maybe this coming session we won't have too many others competing, but I do happen to know it sounds like Smoky Bear is coming back this year too for another run. So, but yeah, no, that is a critical thing to try to do, and well, I like the idea of the working forest license plate, and hopefully maybe some of the folks listening to this will, they can get on ledge.wa.gov and send notes to their legislators telling them to pass that bill. But we'll see. That's a good thing. I can promote things, I guess, in this world. So
yeah.
well, cool. At some point, I'd like to maybe dive a little bit deeper. I don't know. I need to do even some more thinking on this whole wealth gap and urban rural thing because I know there's been a few things that popped up just this week in my day job. As I was in that community that you used to live in yesterday and got back late yesterday. So there's been a lot of time on the road. So maybe at some point in the future we can do another one of these and dive a little bit deeper into it. Maybe even find a third person that wants to come talk about it. Or if you know any other experts, would love to. But I love that you're getting out into the universities. I think that's important. Making sure folks are hearing that voice, and maybe that's part of the problem is us as foresters. We do tend to look to that next generation or the generation beyond, not today. Whereas I feel like a lot of the people that I deal with they're not really truly looking one, two, three generations down. They're looking at today and they're
Yep.
concerned about today and the world they live in. So, well, cool.
Yeah.
The the amazing parts of today's science. You're coming to us via Starlink. So I don't want to keep you from getting out and enjoying the outdoors too much. But is there anything else you wanted to cover or add before we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, gosh, we hit a lot of things, and I agree with you. I think there's we could talk. There's some folks that we could you could invite on the show. I think that would have a really good perspective on some of the urban rural interaction. Maybe not even calling it a divide, just a little different interaction. And that recreational bit with our lands, I think is important for all of us to understand how that impacts rural economies or maybe doesn't impact the rural economy. Um, so yeah, we could probably do this for more time than we have today. Um,
Yeah.
I I would like to say thank you for allowing me to have a conversation with you on your podcast. I've been listening to it. I think it's a great podcast, and so I'm excited to see it grow.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I'm trying to get myself back into the swing of things, between the summer and a few health things and stuff. I had to take a little bit of a break, but we're back on. I've got two or three more guests already lined up to do interviews here in the next couple days. So, but yeah, thank you for making time, and we'll look at probably maybe doing this again. And if you want to shoot me any names of some of those folks you think would be good to bring on or twist their arms, because this is always sometimes I found it sounds really cool to do until you actually say, okay, this is the day I'm going to do it. And then some people are kind of like, oh, wait a minute, I actually have to, get on and do an interview. But, I can see that ag forestry, that the public speaking part, I know it did wonders for me. So it really does help and make things much easier and make you more comfortable getting on doing interviews. So
Oh yeah, you spend 18 months being really uncomfortable. You get good at it.
all right. Well, hey, thank you. And we look forward to the work you're doing in the future.
Thanks.